"Get behind me, Satan." It's quite the change, really. Last week's gospel shows Jesus naming Simon Rock, Peter in Greek, and proclaiming that the gates of the netherworld will not prevail against the church founded on that rock. And yet, just mere minutes later, Jesus uses a very different name for Simon, Satan. So it kind of looks like that promise of never being overthrown didn't last very long. But appearances can be deceiving. And in fact, that's exactly the point Jesus makes. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do. Simon Peter, quite understandably, reacts strongly against Jesus' proclamation that he, the Messiah, God incarnate, must be betrayed, suffer, and die. Anyone would quite naturally want to prevent the suffering and death of their beloved teacher and friend. But we can't rely only on nature. God designed nature, not just birds and trees and rocks, but human nature. So it is good. Yet human nature is wounded, blinded by original sin. And so while Simon Peter's response is natural, it is wrong because we are called to a supernatural way of life, a life of faith and of grace. And this is why last week Jesus took the time to invite Simon's act of faith. Who do you say I am? And by grace, Simon was inspired to recognize the supernatural reality of Jesus as the Son of God. And seeing that faith, Jesus knew it was time to begin to tell them about the mystery of the cross. And he knew this would be difficult for them even when they had faith. He knew it would create confusion and tension. But he told them anyway because they needed to hear it and to be challenged to grow. This is why every Catholic, every evangelizer should be willing at the right time and place to proclaim truths that they know the world will want to reject. And even if some do walk away because of what we teach, the strain of coming to accept difficult teaching, to accept the cross, is necessary for the salvation to be real. Jesus sets this precedent from the top down. The very day he promises to protect the Pope from losing the truth of the gospel, he provides the opportunity to show that same Pope making an awful mistake, and yet he still doesn't lose the gospel. Jesus rebukes Peter, but he does not cast him out or retract his promise. And then we see it again during Holy Week. Simon Peter denies Jesus 3 times, but within a few days is once again told to tend the sheep of Jesus' flock, to lead the church as shepherd, rock, pope of the church, that the netherworld will not prevail against. And this scriptural example is wonderful for us. But it's also easy for us to idealize it. After all, we're talking about St. Peter, the apostle. We know how the story ends. So maybe we don't appreciate how hard it was for Peter and the other apostles in the moment. To be called Satan by your friend, teacher, and Lord. To see that man suffer and die. To watch as the boldest, strongest person of the apostles, the man meant to be the leader, to see him deny the Lord and run away like a coward. The apostles did not know. They could not see how those events would turn around in a few days, much less how it would lead to the conversion of the entire Roman Empire within a few hundred years. We know that it did, but they didn't know that at the time. Sometimes faith in God means simply accepting that you can't understand what God is up to. That you simply have to say, okay, I trust you. I'll hold on, even if it doesn't make sense to me, even if I would do things differently if I were in charge. Because, well, if we can't think like God, we can at least avoid the mistake of thinking only like a human being. That's what faith is. It's the virtue, the ability to transcend mere human thinking, even if we can't quite get to thinking like God. Faith takes the step. And this faith applies not just to Jesus, but to the Catholic Church, the one true church established by Jesus on the rock of Simon Peter's profession of faith. Where Peter is, there is the church. There is God, even when the Pope doesn't seem particularly godly to us. This is why I warned you last week, and now repeat. Do not turn your back on the Pope, no matter what. At the same time, do not give way to laziness, to sloth, to a careless, thoughtless approach to your church, your faith, and your Pope. God promises he will protect the teaching power of the church and the Pope. But it doesn't mean that the Pope will be perfect, as Peter demonstrates for us. So how do we sort through that? First, we want to notice that when Peter makes this mistake and says, Jesus will not die, I will not let it happen, he doesn't make a public proclamation. He's not teaching in this moment. He pulls Jesus aside to tell him he won't die. Because if he were to proclaim, as leader of the apostles, that Jesus was not going to die, that'd be a problem. That'd be heresy. We'd lose the gospel. The Pope's authority, his official teaching power, is not the same thing as his every thought and word. The Pope's personal opinions, the rumors of what he says to people in private, his administrative decisions, his speculation on non-theological topics, these are not protected by the Holy Spirit. There's a famous scene from a novel called Brideshead Revisited that might help. In this story, a priest describes an interview he has with a potential convert. And he says, I asked this guy, supposing the Pope looked up and saw a cloud and said it's going to rain, would that be bound to happen? Oh, yes, Father. But supposing it didn't? He thought a moment and said, I suppose it would be sort of raining spiritually, only we were too sinful to see it. That's absurd. Catholics do not believe the Pope can infallibly predict the weather and that we have to deny what we can see because he said something that clearly isn't true. Simply saying, whatever you say, Father, to priests and the Pope is not faith. It's laziness. It is only when the Pope invokes his sacred authority to teach in an official capacity that we consider it infallible, and then we have to try to accept that. St. Peter said and did some stupid things, but we could kind of say that was really more the actions of Simon the man and less so Peter the Pope. Compare the scene in today's gospel, where he's trying to stop Jesus, with his sermon at Pentecost. Compare Peter's denial of Jesus with the 2 letters he wrote, letters that are now part of the New Testament. Be careful now. It's not our job. It's not realistic for us to sort through every single word and action of every pope and compare it to all of church teaching to decide which ones we take and accept. Honestly, it's better not to pay attention to every word and deed of the Pope of any era. Take note of the big stuff, the authoritative things, high-level documents, canonizations, decrees, that kind of thing. Many of the Pope's daily homilies and interviews are good. Many of them aren't. If they help your faith, hope, and love, great. If not, don't worry. None of those things has much chance of having any effect on what Catholics are expected to believe. And if there is something authoritative from our Pope, the default position is to follow that authority. Not lazily, but with humble, thoughtful, and prayerful engagement. Supposing the Pope authoritatively teaches something I don't like, don't assume he's wrong. Maybe you misunderstand it. Maybe what I'm being told isn't what actually happened. Maybe I'm blinded by my pride. Maybe I need some conversion. And maybe if you like what he says, you need to watch out for the opposite extreme of beating other Catholics over the head with what you think what happened, jumping to accuse them of heresy and schism and sin just because they aren't excited about everything he says and does. St. Paul warns us in the second reading, do not conform yourselves to this age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. This age, thinking as human beings do, is caught up in factions, loyalty to party politics, sound bites, outrage, a simple, is he for us or against us calculation. But thinking as God does, being transformed by the renewal of your minds, that's a process that takes time and grace and effort. Maybe you can't make heads or tails of what God is doing with the synod, with the church, with the Pope. You don't have to figure everything out. You have to trust that God is at work no matter what you see. To be a good Catholic does not require you to like the Pope, but it does mean you have to love him and, yes, respect him. You do not have to think that the Pope is a saint. Many of the popes in history weren't. But you do have to pray for him. You do not have to agree that the Pope is doing a great job administratively and proclaiming the gospel. But you do have to accept his authority when he uses it to lead, to teach, to govern in an official way. And if you think the Pope is wonderful and effective, great. But don't be too quick to accuse others of being heretics because they struggle to see it that way. Regardless of how you feel about the state of the church and the Pope today, confused, excited, mostly unaware, the path for all of us shares a common theme. Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. The apostles didn't understand. Peter himself didn't understand. And their self-denial meant admitting that, denying their desire to have it all figured out before they moved along. They kept trying, and God used them anyway. The truth survived their bumbling mistakes anyway. The church will not fail. The truth will not be lost, even if our understanding may have to grow. In the end, what matters most, we can take comfort in this, what matters most is not theological cleverness. It is not political success. It is not being right in analyzing every movement in the church. We will be judged by our conduct, by our deeds of love that spring from the faith of those who think not as human beings do, but as God does. And God keeps his promises.